The sun dipped low over the hills of Galilee as Jesus, walking in silence, beckoned Peter, James, and John to follow him. It was not the first time. He took only these three from among the 12, but this time felt different. His gaze was fixed, his pace deliberate. The air was cool and quiet as they climbed the high mountain, later known only by its mystery, the Mount of Transfiguration. The disciples were weary, not just from the walk, but from all they had seen and heard in the days before. Jesus had recently spoken words that troubled them, predictions of his suffering, rejection, and death. It didn't make sense to them. How could the Messiah, the Son of the living God, be handed over to be killed? Peter had even rebuked Jesus, only to be sharply corrected. But now, as they climbed higher, there was no room for questions. Only awe. When they reached the peak, the disciples rested while Jesus stood apart to pray. And then it happened. Without warning, a radiant light surrounded Jesus. His face began to shine like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white, brighter than anything the earth had ever produced. It was as though heaven itself had broken through the veil and touched earth in that sacred moment. Peter, James, and John sat upright, unable to speak. Their master, the man they had walked with, eaten with, and seen sleep under the stars, now gleamed with the glory of God himself. They saw not just a man, but something divine. And then came the greater wonder. Two men appeared, speaking with Jesus. They were Moses and Elijah. How the disciples knew it was them, they could not explain. Perhaps it was revealed by the Spirit, or perhaps their presence was too distinct to doubt. One represented the law, Moses, the great deliverer, the man who met God face to face on Sinai. The other was Elijah, the prophet of fire, the voice that called Israel back to God during its darkest times. They stood with Jesus, not above him, not below him, but beside him. They talked, not of power or glory, but of what Jesus was about to accomplish in Jerusalem, his death, his departure, his fulfillment of God's plan. Moses had led the people out of physical slavery. Elijah had called them out of spiritual adultery. But now here was Jesus, the one who would set all people free from the bondage of sin and reconcile them to the Father forever. Peter, overwhelmed by glory and fear, blurted out, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us build 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a thick cloud overshadowed them. From the cloud came a voice they had heard only once before at the Jordan River. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." The disciples fell on their faces, terrified. But Jesus came to them gently, touched them, and said, "Rise, and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one but Jesus alone. What had they just witnessed? Why had Moses and Elijah come? And what did it mean for the path Jesus was about to walk? The journey down the mountain would begin soon, but the answers would unfold slowly, one sacred step at a time. As they descended the mountain in silence, Peter, James, and John could not shake the awe of what they had seen. Jesus walked ahead of them, his expression calm but firm. The glory that had just radiated from him was now hidden again, beneath the simple garment of a traveling rabbi. Still, their hearts burned with questions. Who were Moses and Elijah truly to Jesus? And why had they appeared now? Jesus broke the silence with a command. Tell the vision to no one, until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. Raised from the dead? The word struck them again. Death and resurrection? Their minds struggled to connect the glory they saw with the suffering he kept predicting. Peter whispered to James, "Why Moses and Elijah?" James could only shake his head, equally confused. But what they did not yet understand was that the presence of Moses and Elijah was not random. It was divine. It was a meeting of the law, the prophets, and the Messiah. Moses stood for the law, the Torah, the foundation of Israel's covenant with God. He had climbed Mount Sinai, received commandments written by the finger of God, and led a nation out of bondage. He was the voice of instruction, of obedience, of holiness. Elijah represented the prophets, the messengers of God, who called Israel to repentance, who spoke with fire and thunder, and who pointed always toward a coming Savior. Elijah had never tasted death, taken into heaven in a whirlwind and chariot of fire. His return was prophesied before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, In this glorious encounter, they came to Jesus not as equals, but as witnesses. They came to pass the torch. Jesus was the fulfillment of both their ministries. Where Moses gave the law, Jesus would fulfill it. Where Elijah called people to repentance, Jesus would bring the power to transform hearts forever. The law could only show sin. Jesus would cleanse it. The prophets could only cry out in hope. Jesus would be the hope fulfilled. And there was another reason they came. Moses had once asked to see God's glory. On Mount Sinai, God told him no man could see his face and live. So God hid Moses in the cleft of a rock, passing by with only a glimpse of his back. But now, on this new mountain, Moses looked into the face of Jesus, full of glory, full of grace, and lived. Elijah had once fled into a cave, terrified and defeated, asking God to end his life. But God met him there not with fire, wind, or earthquake, but in a still small voice. Now Elijah stood in heavenly peace, speaking to the one who calmed every storm. This meeting was not only for Jesus, it was for the disciples, and for all humanity. The Father was testifying, "This is my Son, listen to him." Not Moses, not Elijah, not even the cloud or the voice. Listen to Jesus. And Jesus, in glory, received their presence with calm authority, not surprised, not nervous, but prepared. He knew what lay ahead: the cross, the tomb, the darkness of death, but also the resurrection. Moses and Elijah encouraged him, just as angels would in Gethsemane. They had come to say, "You are the one we pointed toward. Finish the work. Redeem the world." The disciples could not yet grasp the full meaning, but Jesus knew. The law and the prophets had now bowed to the one who would bring grace and truth. The mountain behind them shimmered in memory, but the road ahead led to Calvary. Long after they left the mountaintop, Peter could still hear their voices, not clearly, but faintly, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus speaking together. It was not loud, nor dramatic. It was holy, and though the disciples were heavy with sleep at first, they were fully awake by the time Jesus shone with glory. What did they talk about? Why would these two ancient men of God appear at that precise moment? Only to speak of Jesus' departure. As Luke would later record, it was not just about death. The word used, Exodus, carried the weight of divine purpose. It wasn't only an end, it was a deliverance. Jesus stood between the two, calmly conversing with men who had walked the earth centuries before. Moses, once a prince of Egypt turned deliverer, and Elijah, the fearless prophet who had called fire from heaven. Both had faced rejection from their people. Both had met God on high places. Both had seen glimpses of glory and now stood in the fullness of it. And both had unfinished stories. Moses had led Israel out of Egypt, but he had not entered the promised land. He had only viewed it from afar. His mission ended short of completion. But now, here he was, standing on a mountain in the land of promise, speaking with the Messiah who would open the gates of heaven not just to Israel, but to the whole world. Elijah had once called Israel to choose between Baal and the Lord. He had challenged kings, called drought, performed miracles, but even after all that, the people still rebelled. He had run to the wilderness, weary and feeling alone. Now, he stood with the one who would bear all the sin and rebellion of humanity on his shoulders and conquer it forever. Their conversation was more than just encouragement. It was a divine passing of mission. Moses and Elijah had prepared the way. Jesus would complete the journey. They did not advise him. They confirmed him. They spoke of what he must do in Jerusalem, how he must be handed over, suffer, and die. But they also spoke with reverence and confidence. They knew this was not defeat. It was victory through sacrifice. As they stood in the cloud of divine presence, time seemed to collapse. The past met the present. Heaven kissed earth. Jesus stood as the bridge between both. The Father's voice had sealed it. "This is my Son. Hear him." Moses had once said, "God will raise up a prophet like me from among you. Listen to him." That promise was now fulfilled. Elijah had come to prepare the hearts of the people, to turn the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to wisdom. His work, too, was fulfilled. Jesus alone remained on the mountain when the cloud lifted, not because Moses and Elijah had failed, but because he was greater. He was the fulfillment, the final word. The disciples didn't understand it yet, not fully, but a seed had been planted deep in their hearts. They had seen heaven touch earth. They had seen Jesus as more than teacher or healer. They had seen him as king, as the radiant sun, worthy of worship. And still, they would be tested. But the memory of that conversation in glory, the divine meeting on the mount, would never leave them. It would carry them through the darkest days to come. As the mountain faded behind them and the descent continued, the disciples walked in silence. The glory of what they had seen had left them trembling, but also confused. Why now? Why had the light of heaven appeared only to vanish again? Why speak of death when Jesus had just been revealed in such splendor? Jesus, aware of their thoughts, spoke gently. The Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. These words weighed heavily on their hearts. The Transfiguration had not been just a heavenly display, it had been a divine preparation. Jesus was preparing to walk into the darkest moment in human history, the crucifixion. And Moses and Elijah had come to confirm that this path was not failure, it was fulfillment. To understand the glory, the disciples would need to understand the suffering. And that was why the meeting on the mount mattered so deeply. Moses had led the Israelites through an exodus, a journey from slavery to freedom, through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. But Jesus' exodus would go deeper. His departure in Jerusalem would lead humanity from the slavery of sin into the freedom of grace. And the path would not be parted waters. It would be a cross and a grave. Elijah, too, had once despaired under a tree, feeling the weight of rejection and loneliness. He had fled from a queen's wrath, crying out, "I have had enough, Lord." But God was not done with him then, and neither was he done with the story of Israel. Elijah's return on the mount was a sign. Even the greatest prophets had felt overwhelmed, but they had been upheld by God. Now Jesus, too, would walk through loneliness, rejection, and pain, but with divine assurance. And there was more. The disciples didn't know it yet, but they themselves would walk their own paths of suffering. Peter would deny Jesus before a fire. James would be the first apostle martyred. John would be exiled to a lonely island. The vision on the mount was a gift, a glimpse of Jesus' true nature, a reminder that the one who would hang on the cross in shame had stood in glory with the heroes of their faith. Peter would later write in his second letter, "We were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" In that moment, they saw the cross not as defeat, but as divine destiny. Jesus would not be forced to the cross. He would choose it. As Moses lifted a serpent in the wilderness to heal the people, Jesus would be lifted up to heal the world. The meeting on the mount was a message. Suffering does not cancel glory. It reveals it. And sacrifice does not weaken the Messiah. It proves his power. For now, the disciples were not ready to speak of what they had seen. Jesus had told them to keep silent until after his resurrection. And so they carried the memory, quietly, like a flame within their souls. They had seen the end from the beginning. They had seen the king in his kingdom, before the thorns, before the nails, before the tomb. The cross was coming, but so was the crown. The memory of the radiant light was powerful, but so was the memory of the cloud. Thick, holy, terrifying. When it had descended on the mount, it silenced even Peter, who only moments before had spoken foolishly in awe, suggesting 3 tabernacles for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, as though they were equals. But the cloud had come like the presence of God on Mount Sinai, like the cloud that filled the tabernacle in the wilderness, like the cloud that led Israel by day. It had a message. It was not there by accident. The disciples, covered by it, heard the voice. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." God had spoken before, at Jesus' baptism, saying nearly the same words. But this time, there was something added. Hear him. Why now? Because it was time to make it clear. Jesus was not just a teacher of the law. He was greater than the law. Jesus was not just a prophet in the line of Elijah. He was greater than the prophets. The cloud came to silence comparisons, to remove distractions, to tell the disciples to shift their focus. God was saying, don't build 3 tents. Don't cling to old symbols. Listen to my Son. When the cloud lifted, Moses and Elijah were gone. Jesus stood alone. And that was the point. The age of law had served its purpose. The age of the prophets had prepared the way. But now came the fullness of time. The Son, the Savior, the living Word. The cloud that once hid God's glory in the wilderness now revealed God's plan. Jesus would be the new tabernacle, the place where God and humanity met. He would be the voice to listen to, not beside the law and the prophets, but above them. Peter would later reflect on this. He had wanted to capture the moment, to preserve it. But Jesus had not come to be enshrined. He had come to be followed. The mountain was not a final destination. It was a starting point. And the cloud, though fearful, had wrapped them in purpose. This was not just about glory. It was about authority. The disciples needed to know, before the trial came, that the one they followed had heaven's full approval. God himself had said it. This is my son. No more guessing. No more uncertainty. No more comparisons with prophets past. Jesus was the true voice of God. And from now on, every command, every word, every act of his ministry carried the weight of divine authority. Even when he spoke of suffering, even when he predicted betrayal, even when he said he would rise again, they were to listen. And when he went to the cross, they were to remember that voice in the cloud. The cloud was not just a sign of power. It was a call to trust. When darkness would come at noon on the day of crucifixion, and the skies would again be filled with mystery, the disciples would tremble. But later, they would remember the cloud of light that spoke of love, and the Son who stood alone. The cloud had not come to confuse them. It had come to prepare them, to tell them, when you cannot see clearly, when fear surrounds you, when others disappear, look to my Son, and listen to him. The vision on the mount faded, but the mission below had just begun. Jesus and his disciples returned to a world far removed from divine glory, a world where arguments rose, demons tormented, and faith often faltered. At the foot of the mountain, they found a distraught father and a boy possessed by an unclean spirit. The other disciples had tried to cast it out, but failed. Jesus, fresh from divine affirmation, was met not with worship, but with human chaos. It was a pattern the disciples were beginning to see: glory above, suffering below. And now, after the Transfiguration, Jesus began to speak more plainly about his mission. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will rise again. This time, there was no parable, no veil, just truth. The disciples were distressed. They remembered the light, the cloud, the voice. But how could that radiant Jesus possibly be handed over to die? This is why Moses and Elijah had appeared, not only to affirm Jesus, but to prepare him, and by extension, prepare them. Jesus knew what was ahead: betrayal, hatred, injustice, and the cruel wood of the cross. He also knew how easy it would be for his disciples to fall away when all they saw was weakness. The Transfiguration was not just for glory's sake, it was a preparation for rejection. He wanted them to remember that the man hanging between thieves was the same one who had stood in blinding light between Moses and Elijah. He wanted them to know that the cross would not be the end of his story. Moses had once been rejected by his own people before being called to deliver them. Elijah had been hunted and hated, forced to flee into the wilderness. Jesus, too, would be despised by the very ones he came to save. And the disciples, one day, would walk that same road. Peter would be crucified. James would be beheaded. John would be exiled. But they would endure because they had seen the King in his glory. They had seen the proof that suffering does not erase purpose. Jesus knew human hearts. He knew that even those closest to him would stumble when the sword was drawn. But he gave them this gift, the memory of the mountain, to carry them through the valley of fear. The road to Jerusalem was ahead. It would be a road of rejection, mocking, lashes, and thorns. But it was also the road of fulfillment. The law and the prophets had pointed to this moment for centuries. The Messiah would suffer. He would be pierced for our transgressions. He would be crushed for our iniquities. And by his wounds, we would be healed. The disciples didn't yet understand the full picture. They still hoped for crowns before crosses, for thrones before thorns. But Jesus would show them that the path to resurrection always goes through death. And the vision on the mount, the meeting with Moses and Elijah, was heaven's way of saying, "This is the way. Walk in it." The road ahead would shake them. But what they saw on that mountain, it would never leave them. Years later, the memory of that mountain still burned brightly in Peter's heart. Rome was closing in. The persecution of Christians had intensified. Followers of Jesus were being imprisoned, scattered, and killed. Peter himself knew his time was short. He would soon be executed for his faith. But before his departure, he picked up his pen and wrote to the scattered believers across the Roman Empire, offering them one final word of testimony. For we did not follow cleverly devised stories, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice when we were with him on the sacred mountain. 2 Peter 1 verses 16 to 18. It had been many years since that day, but the vision was still clear in Peter's soul. Jesus had shone like the sun. The voice from heaven had thundered. Moses and Elijah had appeared in heavenly light. And Peter had been there, weak, trembling, overwhelmed, but chosen to witness it all. Why had God chosen to give them that moment? Because God knew the road ahead would be dark, not just for Jesus, but for those who followed him. The Transfiguration was not given to keep the disciples on the mountain. It was given to sustain them off it, in prison cells, in hidden caves, in silent martyrdom. When hope would flicker, they would remember the Son who had shone like the sun. The early church grew under the shadow of the cross, but it also grew with the memory of the glory. The law and the prophets had bowed to Jesus. The cloud had declared his divine sonship, and Jesus had walked forward from that. Mountain eyes, fixed on Jerusalem, not turning back, not hesitating, but choosing obedience unto death, and then resurrection. The disciples would never forget that after Moses and Elijah vanished, Jesus remained. And that was the message for all generations. When the law convicts you, when the prophets challenge you, when the world rejects you, when the glory fades, Jesus remains. When Peter preached in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, he didn't mention the mountaintop. He preached Christ crucified and risen. But somewhere deep in his heart, he carried the light he saw that day. John, too, remembered. In his gospel, he would write, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." John 1 verse 14. He had seen it, literally. Glory on the mountain, glory in the garden, glory even on the cross. The Transfiguration was not just a memory. It was a glimpse of eternity, a brief pulling back of the curtain, a reminder that Jesus was not only the man of sorrows, but the radiant King. And one day, all who follow him would be with him in that glory, no longer needing tabernacles or tents, no longer overshadowed by fear or confusion, but face to face with the one who stood shining between Moses and Elijah, the one who fulfilled the law, fulfilled the prophets, conquered death, and reigns forever. Jesus Christ, the beloved Son. And we will hear the voice again. "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And this time, we will never forget again.